In a time where Melkor dwelt in prison in Valinor, and after war has been fought for sake of the Elves, there is another debate taking place. Within the Ring of Doom, the Valar again gather in council. Some Valar wished that the Eldar would remain free in Middle-earth, and would use their powers to make the land free of Melkor's influence. The chief among the Valar who held this view was Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, who always cared and watched the peoples of Middle-earth. The majority of the Valar knew that Melkor's control over the lands away from Valinor was too strong, and they feared for the safety of the Elves. There was a selfish motive also. The Valar wanted community with the Elves over anything else. Mandos, the doomsman of the Valar, and the Lord of the Halls of Mandos, which is the waiting place of the dead, broke his silence, and he said, "So it is doomed." Tolkien then writes after this, "From this summons came many woes that afterwards befell." These will be covered in a later video, and especially involves the Elven prince Feanor. One thing to consider was the worship and reverence that the Elves had for their home by the water, Cuivenin. Many Elves wanted to stay there, and feared the Valar as fierce, violent beings of war, as they had only seen them in wrath against Melkor. They did, however, trust Orome, the first Valar to interact with their people, and on friendly terms. 3 ambassadors were chosen to go to Valinor on behalf of the greater host of the people. Imin was the first elf to awaken, and his spouse was Iminye. Their son was Ilion, who would later be the High King of the Vanyar, the Fair Elves. The son of Ilion and the grandson of Imin was Ingwe, the first High King of the Vanyar, who would eventually be the mightiest of all of the Elves. Ingwe means first person, and Ingwe would go on the journey to Valinor. Tata was the second of the Elf fathers to awaken at Cuivenin, and after Imin, his spouse was Tatye, and 400 years after their awakening, in 1495 of the Years of the Trees, Finwë was born. Finwë became the first High King of the Noldor, the Deep Elves. Finwë would go as the second ambassador to Valinor, as the leader of the Noldor. Enel was the third of the Elves to awaken, and his spouse was Enelia. Their firstborn son was Elwë. His brothers were Olwë and Elmo. Elwë means Star Man, and he was the leader of the Sea Elves, or the Teleri. However, Elwë would eventually become the king of the Sindar, or the Grey Elves, while his brother, Olwë, would take up leadership of the Teleri. These 3 elves loved Valinor and were amazed by the beauty and the glory of the Undying Lands. These 3 elves spoke before their people and tried to convince them to go to Valinor. The terms the elves were defined by at this time were decided based on whether they went on the journey or not. At this time, the Eldar, or the people of the stars, was the name for all of the elves. This term would later be applied only to those who went to the Undying Lands and not to those who stayed. Of all the Eldar, all of Ingwe's people went, most of Finwë's people went, and most of Elwë's people went. These elves were after called the Calaquendi, the Elves of the Light. Those who refused the journey altogether were called the Avari, the Unwilling. All of Ingwe's people departed to Valinor and decided to stay for all the ages of the world. His people, the Vanyar, were the most loved of Manwë, the High King of the Valar, and Varda, the High Queen of the Valar. Few among men had ever spoken to the Vanyar. Finwë's people, the Noldor, were friends of Aule the Maker, the Smith, and the father of the dwarves. And they would not remain in Valinor forever, and the Noldor were the most notable of the elves in the Silmarillion and all of the First Age. The largest group of the elves was the Teleri, Elwë's people. Of the Teleri, not all made the journey. They were known as the Sea Elves, or the Falmari, and they made great music and poetry. The term for the elves that tarried upon the road was the Umanyar, but the Umanyar and the Avari are collectively known as the Moraquendi, the Elves of the Darkness. The Eldar on this journey went from one end of Arda to the other. It was the longest journey ever undertaken in the history of Arda and Middle-earth. Over time, many Eldar came upon the Anduin before the Misty Mountains. Many elves liked the river and decided to dwell in these lands, and these were the Silvan elves who would eventually inhabit the Woodland Realm in the north and Lothlorien in the south, before Galadriel appeared. The Misty Mountains were the most significant barrier to the elves, and here Orome, the huntsman of the Valar, made a pathway through the mountains, ever after known as the High Pass. The High Pass may sound familiar, as this was the original road of Thorin's company as they traveled over the Misty Mountains before being trapped in Goblin Town. There were elves that dwelt in Eriador also, but did not cross westward into Beleriand. They were led by Lenwe, and they were after called the Nandor, or those who go back. Later, when orcs began to trouble these elves, Lenwe took his people into Beleriand, as Middle-earth and Beleriand were still under the stars before the sun and moon. When the elves saw the sea, many grew afraid and hid in Beleriand. Orome knew he couldn't get them across, and went to Manwe and Varda to ask for aid. It was at this time that Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, made music upon the shore, and many elves desired the sea afterwards, especially the Teleri. Ulmo brought up an island and moved it. The island lay in the Bay of Valar. The Vanyar and the Noldor went upon the isle, and Ulmo drew the island to the Undying Lands. A small part of the island was left, and that is where the Isle of Valar off the coast of southern Beleriand came from, and would be the last stronghold of the elves before the drowning of Beleriand. The Teleri arrived too late and missed the drawing of the isle over the sea. Many of the Teleri still searched for their lord Elwe. Elwe was entranced by Melian the Maya, and was caught in a state of stillness because of his love for her that would last 1,000 years. The woods of Nan Elmoth grew tall before he would break from his trance. After long searching, the Teleri took Olwe to be their king, the brother of Elwe. Ose and Uinen, the Maiar that served Ulmo, taught these elves, and they learned the arts of the seas from these two Maiar. After many years, Ulmo drew them over the sea. Some remained for sake of Ose, who grew sad at their departure, and these elves were the Falathrim, the elves of the Falas. They made the havens of Brithambar and Eglarest, and their leader was Kirdam the shipwright, who was the sole elf taking the responsibility of seeing all of the elves into the west until the end of the elves in Middle-earth altogether. Many friends of Elwe were left behind and awaited his return. Elwe eventually awoke from his trance. Elwe did desire to see the light of the two trees of Valinor, but he could behold the light of the trees in Melian, and he was satisfied in that. Elwe appeared as a lord of the Maiar, his hair grey-silver, tallest of all of the children of Iluvatar, and he was known as Elu Thingol, King Greymantle, leader of the Sindar, the Grey Elves, neither elves of light nor elves of darkness, who had the greatest kingdom in Middle-earth. Finwë grieved when he learned that Elwe did not come, for they were good friends. The Isle of the Teleri became Tol Aresea, the Lonely Isle. The Teleri lived there, under the stars, and yet within sight of the trees. The Teleri made their dwelling at Alqualonde, later the haven of the swans, for they desired the sea over the trees of the Valar. A gap was made in the Pelori Mountains for the Noldor and Vanyar to live in light of the trees and in light of the stars. There was a great hill raised called Tuna, and the city of Tirion was raised upon it. This was the city of the elves, the first of many. The greatest tower of this city was the Tower of Ingwe, Mindon Eldalieva. Yavanna made for them a white tree, named Galathilion, from which eventually the White Tree of Gondor would be descended. The Noldor became great in knowledge and skill. They loved the making of speech and letters. Gems were first discovered by the Noldor, and they gave them freely. The Vanyar would later dwell with Manwe on Tanaquatil, and leave the Noldor, while the Noldor remained in Tirion. The Noldor adventured throughout the land and learned much from their journeying and studying of the substances and creatures of Aman. There would be great leaders of the elves born in the Undying Lands, and the greatest, and yet most controversial among these, is Feanor, the son of Finwë. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please don't forget to leave a like down below, and also don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more Lord of the Rings lore videos and Lord of the Rings Online videos. In the next episode of this lore series, what I'm going to be doing is going over the unrest of the Noldor in the Undying Lands, and what eventually leads to their departure. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.